In this week's video, I want to talk about camera firmware. What is it? Why you should consider updating it? How do you update it? And more. I'm going to be doing demonstrations using Canon, Nikon and a Fujifilm camera, so I really hope you're going to stick around and enjoy the video. Welcome to the Photogenius channel. Hi, Paul here from Photogenius. Welcome to my channel where I post regular photography tutorials. I share tips and tricks. Occasionally I do gear reviews as well. If you are new here, please consider subscribing. Now, a few days ago I put a question out on YouTube asking about firmware, and based on the 80% plus of replies where people didn't know much about firmware or would like to learn more about firmware, this video is for you guys, or for that matter anybody else who would like to get more from the digital camera. So let's start by talking about what firmware actually is. Behind me I have my laptop connected to a monitor. It's running a program called Adobe Lightroom, and that is software that was downloaded to the computer and allows me to edit my images. Now here is my iPhone, and this is run by an operating system that is made by Apple, of course, and Apple are really good at issuing updates to the operating system, and these updates might do things like fix bugs, improve security, sometimes give me new features that I didn't have previously. And it's no different with cameras and also lenses. Firmware is effectively just like software. It's what makes the device work. So why should you update your camera's firmware? Well, let me start by saying you don't have to. Your camera will work just fine straight out of the box. But over time, you'll generally find that most camera manufacturers will issue these firmware updates every now and again to fix things like flaws with the camera, bugs, that kind of stuff. And generally, this is going to make the camera work better. You may find you've got better functions, maybe better battery performance. You may even find that after doing a firmware update, your camera has functions that you didn't have previously. So generally, updating the firmware is a good thing to do. Here is my Nikon Z6. Now this camera is close to being 3 years old, and during that time Nikon have released 12 firmware updates that have fixed issues, improved the camera's performance, and also given the camera new functions such as face and eye detection that was not a feature found on the Z6 when it was first released. So before I demonstrate how to update the firmware on your camera, I want to give thanks and also a very special shout out to two people, Philip Gibson and Tina Johnson. You guys are my very first two founding members on Patreon. If you enjoy watching my tutorials here on YouTube, then you may like to know that Photogenius is now on Patreon, and you can support this channel and receive members only benefits such as video previews, behind the scenes posts, photos and much more. If you want to find out more about Patreon, how you can support this channel and get benefits, there's a link in the description below this video. Okay, so now as promised, I'm going to walk you through doing a firmware update. We're going to look at a Canon camera first. We're going to look at Nikon, Fuji as well. You will see that the process camera to camera is actually very similar. Now make sure you stick around to the end of the video, because towards the end I'm also going to be looking at updating lens firmware as well. Before you begin with any updates, make sure you use a fully charged battery. Now the first thing you need to do is to check which firmware version your camera is using currently. On this camera it's version 1.1. Now you'll see that if I press the set button, the camera is now letting me know that the next step requires a memory card containing the update to be inserted into the camera. Next, I need to find out if there is updated firmware available for this particular camera. Now you can do this by visiting the Photogenius website. I'm going to click on the Canon link, which takes me straight to the Canon website where I can enter the model of the camera. Now here we see that firmware version 1.2 is available, so I click on the link and now we see what this latest update has to offer. Again, I follow the link to the next page, and here we can specify if we are using a PC or a Mac. Now all I need to do is click on the link to download the firmware to my computer. So the new firmware is on my computer, but of course I need to get it onto the camera. To do this, I use a memory card, but it is recommended you format the card first. Formatting a memory card can easily be done in camera, but it's really important to stress that when you format a card, all the photos and all the data will be lost. So now I take the formatted card out of the camera and connect it to my computer using a card reader. I'm using a Mac for this, but I imagine the process, if you're a PC user, will be much the same. Here in the download section is the DMG file that I downloaded from the Canon website. Now all I need to do is double click on this to view contents, and we see a couple of folders. Now the update procedure folder contains full instructions should you need them in a PDF that you can print out. The other file is a .fir file, and of course this is the firmware. Now next I'm going to open another Finder window. EOS is the SD card, and this contains two folders. Now it's important that I don't put the firmware in these folders. Instead I just drag it onto the SD card so it sits alongside the existing files and folders. Now of course I remove the card from the computer and I need to put it in the camera. Now a side note, with this particular Canon camera, before you do the update you need to make sure the camera is in the program mode. So for the final step, all I need to do now is to select firmware from the camera's menu and choose OK. The camera has identified that new firmware is available on the SD card, so pressing OK to confirm that I want to continue, and the update begins. Updating firmware can take a minute or two, so a reminder once again that it is really important to have a fully charged battery. So with the Canon done, I'm next going to demonstrate how I updated the firmware on my Fujifilm X100S. Now you Nikon users, don't go away, you're coming up next. Now remember, every camera is different. On this particular Fujifilm camera you won't find firmware in the menu. Instead you have to hold the display button down on the back of the camera as you turn the camera on. And now I know the camera is currently using firmware version 1.03. The next step is to see if there is new firmware available for this camera, so it's over to the Fujifilm website where I can select my region or country, choose firmware. Now this is an X series camera, and as you can see the latest firmware is version 1.21. Now this of course is an upgrade from 1.03, so I'm going to click on the download button. Whilst the firmware was downloading, I formatted the SD card in camera. Now a reminder once again that formatting a card will delete all the contents on the card, but it is an essential part of the process. I remove the card from the camera and connect to my laptop. Next I need to drag the firmware file from my downloads onto the SD card, remove the card and pop it back into the camera. With the SD card now back in the camera, I simply hold down the display button and turn the camera on. Now I press OK, and as you can see the camera has located the new firmware on the SD card. So all I need to do now is select OK once again and wait. The firmware is now updated and we are done. Now when it came to updating the firmware on my Nikon cameras, I checked the Nikon website and all my cameras were up to date. But don't worry, because I'm going to show you how I updated the firmware on this Nikon lens. And the process for updating the firmware on a lens is actually the same as the process for updating the firmware on the camera body. So you're not really missing out here. Let me show you how it went. If you have a Nikon camera, you should be able to find firmware in the setup menu. It may take a while to scroll through all the different options. Now what we see here are two sets of numbers. The C is for camera. So this is the camera firmware which is currently up to date. Below this is LF. Now this is lens firmware for whichever lens is currently attached to the camera. The lens I'm using is the 85mm f1.8s prime lens. So if we now go to the Nikon website, choose Z mount lenses and select the lens from the list, we now see that firmware version 1 has been updated to version 1.01. So of course I'm going to download the new update to my laptop. If you've been watching this video all the way through, you will of course see now that the process is almost identical camera to camera. So whilst the lens firmware is downloading to my laptop, I'm going to format the memory card inside the camera. So the next step is to connect the card to the computer and move the firmware onto the card. Please note that with this particular update, I had to open a subfolder to get to the file and drag it onto the card. So the firmware is now on this memory card. All I've got to do, of course, is pop this into the camera to update the firmware on this particular lens. Turn the camera on and select firmware from the menu. Now select update and press the OK button on the back of the camera. Now as you can see, the camera has found that there is new lens firmware available on the SD card. So all I need to do is select yes and the update begins. Once done, I turn the camera off to reset and complete the process. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up because it really does help the channel get noticed. Consider subscribing if you're not already subscribed. I try to put out new videos every single week, and of course every video is designed to help you get more from your digital camera. If you want to find out more about Patreon, how you can support this channel but also get access to bonus content like exclusive photos, upfront videos, behind the scenes stuff and more, there's a link in the description below. Hope to see you again sometime soon. See ya. Bye.